Hello everyone, my name is Dakoba and welcome back to Satisfactory. Today we're going to be building a solid biofuel power plant. This is likely going to be the first power plant structure you create in a new world, and the design we're going to be looking at today will generate 450 megawatts of power, which will be plenty to see you through the early phases of the game all the way until you get to coal power in phase 2. Now this power plant is going to take leaves and wood, which are the two primary sources of biomass in the early game, and turn them into solid biofuel. In order to do this, you'll need to have a few milestones unlocked. In order for this plant to work, you'll need the base building and logistics milestone from Tier 1, and the obstacle clearing milestone in Tier 2. Now the design can run with Mark 1 belts at 50% capacity, that's up to 225 megawatts of power generation. But in order to get the full 450 megawatts of power, you are going to need the Mark II belts from the Logistics Mark II milestone in Tier 2. We'll talk about that after we go through the build. Now this power plant is built on a 5x8 foundation platform. I've created a set of walls around mine in order to serve as guidelines, but these are optional. The orientation of the build does not matter. You can start at any corner and we'll work our way in a horseshoe shape around the platform. Our first step is going to be to set up 2 storage containers. We want these right at the edge of the platform with the orange input facing out and the green output facing in. These are going to store the leaves and wood that will power the plant. We want these on the center of 2 corner foundations, like so. Now I like to use a lookout tower in order to get an aerial view while I'm building, in order to make sure that I have a nice alignment while I place things down. Next up, we're going to need 2 constructors. These will be set up directly in front of these 2 storage containers, and they're going to turn our leaves and grass into biomass. We'll connect those with conveyor belts. In front of the outer constructor, we're going to want to set up a merger with the green output facing forward. We want this reasonably close to the constructor, as we don't have a ton of space to work here. When building our conveyors, we can press R to go into the straight build mode, which will make sure that they have nice, neat lines and right angles. In front of our merger, we want to place down another storage container facing forward. This storage container is for storing biomass produced by the first 2 constructors, as well as giving us a place to drop off additional biomass if we choose to get some of it from alien DNA, for example. In front of that storage container, we'll place another constructor, and we'll set this one to produce solid biofuel. Next up, we're going to begin placing our biomass burners. We'll want to align the input on our biomass burner to the center of a foundation platform and place it right up against the wall. We're going to build 8 all along this wall. By holding the control key, they'll snap in place, making it very simple to place them neatly. Next, we'll place 7 more biomass burners on the opposite side facing directly into these. We'll want to make sure that our 2 inputs line up. 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Instead of an 8th biomass burner on the second row, we're going to place another storage container with the green output facing into the biomass burner array. And we'll connect the output of our last constructor into the input on the storage container. This will give us a nice backlog of solid biofuel, which will allow the plant to function as a battery backup later on in the game. Finally, we'll connect our output to the inputs on all of our biomass burners. We'll start by placing a splitter in between our storage container and our first biomass burner. We want to make sure the input on the splitter is coming from the storage container and the central output is going into the first biomass burner. We'll then be able to use the left output of our splitter to run a conveyor line through the center of our biomass burner array and place additional splitters along this conveyor to feed solid biofuel into each of the burners. And next, we'll connect the outputs of all the splitters into all of the different biomass burners. Finally, we need to connect power to all of our biomass burners and tie it into our grid. I recommend placing a single power pole next to each biomass burner and daisy chaining them together. In addition to connecting all the biomass burners together in this way, it'll give you plenty of access points whenever you want to run a new power line out of your power plant. And just like that, we're producing 450 megawatts of power, which should be plenty to satisfy our factory building needs all the way until you get into phase 2 and get coal power unlocked. Now, there is one thing to note with this power plant design, and that has to do with the belting. While building this, I only used Mark I belts. And as long as you're using less than 225 megawatts of power, the Mark I belts will fully satisfy your power needs within this plant design. However, if you want to unlock the full potential of the plant and produce 450 megawatts of power, there is a section of belts that needs to be upgraded to Mark II. Those are the belts between our first 2 constructors and our 3rd constructor. Using the Mark I belts, that 3rd constructor can only run at 50% capacity and will only produce enough solid biofuel to generate 225 megawatts of power. Now, since biomass burners are intelligent and will only consume as much fuel as is required to satisfy the needs of the power that's being drawn from them, as long as you keep your total power consumption threshold below that 50% marker, you won't run into any problems using the Mark I belts. However, as soon as you unlock the Mark II belts with the logistics Tier 2 milestone in Tier 2, you're going to want to upgrade the belts within this section, which will allow the plant to fully satisfy up to 450 megawatts of power as long as enough biomass is supplied in the form of leaves and wood. And for the sake of clarity, 225 megawatts of power is not a small amount. My factory was pretty robust when I built this plant, and it was only drawing 90 megawatts of power, so 225 is probably enough to see you all the way into the next phase. If you want to operate there, it's almost certainly enough to last you until you can unlock the Logistics Mark II, that second tier of conveyor belts. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about how this plant actually works and why this design is so well suited for our early power needs. It comes down to efficiency. If we look at different fuel types, we can actually see the energy value of those fuel types in megajoules. And if we look at our machines, we can see how much power they draw in terms of megawatts. A megawatt is 1 joule, a watt is 1 joule per second. So 4 megawatts means that this machine will use 4 megajoules of energy per second. Now, if we look at leaves, we can see that 1 unit of leaves provides 15 megajoules. So that will power this machine for a little under 4 seconds. And a biomass burner will process the leaves at that speed. Now we can do a little bit of math and we can see that 10 leaves turns into 5 biomass. And if we look at our leaves and say that that's 15 megajoules, 10 leaves would be 150 megajoules. So 1 biomass is 180 megajoules. That's 1 biomass. So 10 leaves or 150 megajoules turns into 900 megajoules of energy when we convert it into biomass. If we look at solid biofuel, this goes even further. If we look at our constructor for solid biofuel, we'll see that 8 biomass turns into 4 solid biofuel. So this is cut in half yet again in terms of total number, but 1 biomass is 180 megajoules. If we multiply that by 8, we get 1440 megajoules. So that 8 biomass contains 1440 megajoules, whereas 1 solid biofuel is 450 megajoules. And if we multiply that by 4, we get 1800 megajoules. So the equivalent energy of the 8 biomass to the 4 solid biofuel is a difference between 1440 joules of energy and 1800 joules of energy. We get a free 360 joules of energy by making this transition. So by doing these processing steps, we gain many times the amount of energy available to us if we were burning the leaves or wood directly. Now, as I said before, biomass burners are intelligent. They only consume as much fuel as is required. I've had these burners running for the duration that I've been speaking. And if we take a look at this, you'll see that they haven't consumed any fuel yet. That's because these burners aren't actually connected to any machines. They're not consuming any power. What this means is that they'll continue to stockpile and bank fuel. And only when that fuel is drawn on, only when we're connected to machines that are using that power, will it consume it. And it will consume it perfectly efficiently. So one of these solid biofuels, which contains 450 megajoules of power, remember the constructor we looked at takes 4 megawatts. So 1 solid biofuel will be able to power that constructor for 112 and a half seconds, almost 2 minutes, from 1 solid biofuel. So another way to think of this is to say that if we're using the Mark I belts throughout the plant and only producing 30 solid biofuel per minute, that'll be enough to provide constant power to 60 constructors. And that gives you a sense of scale for the amount of power that we can produce here. Even several pretty robust factories at this stage of the game is unlikely to push into the scale of 60 production machines. And once we get the Mark II belts, that doubles up to 120. Now, one of the effects of this is that when we're thinking about biomass as a power source in the early game, we can think about it in terms of us reaching a budget that it'll take for us to transition into the mid-game and establish a more permanent power source later on, probably with coal in phase 2. There's some amount of power that it's going to take to produce all of the items that we're going to need to run all of our machines for the duration of time that it takes in order for us to reach that point. And all we need to do is make sure that we are able to gather that much biomass and translate that into energy. And that's what this power plant does, is it takes that biomass that we gather and turns it into biofuel very efficiently so that we can so that we don't need to worry about power through this part of the game. Now, as far as the number of biomass burners that we've set up, if we take our constructor producing solid biofuel and set that to 100% clock speed, the default clock speed, you'll see that we're producing 60 solid biofuel per minute, and each biomass burner can consume 4 solid biofuel per minute. So it'll take 15 biomass burners to consume the solid biofuel if it's being produced at 100% efficiency. Again, that requires the Mark II belts in this sort of intermediary section. But once we have that, all 15 of these burners will run and we'll be generating plenty of power. And by having the storage containers, especially this biomass storage container, we can even inject additional biomass if we, for example, end up going hunting for critters and using the alien DNA to produce large amounts of biomass. We can simply place that into this container and it will consume that fuel. So we have a manual drop off for biomass. Now, since we have 2 inputs and they're for different resources, the wood and the leaves, we want to make sure that we're inserting the correct resource into the correct constructor. Now, it is completely reasonable to run this on wood alone. Once you have the chainsaw, you should be able to gather plenty of wood from almost any part of the map in order to fully provide for this power plant with just wood. If you are going to use 2 containers, I like to drop the resource in front of the storage containers to clearly mark which one is which. So by placing a small pile of leaves on the ground in front of the leaf storage container and a small pile of wood on the ground in front of the wood storage container, there's no confusion about which resource goes into which container. And that's going to do it for today. I hope you guys have found this guide to a solid biofuel power plant in Satisfactory helpful. Leave a like if you have and subscribe if you'd like to see more. My name is the Koba, and I hope you have an efficient day. I'll see you soon.